I'm going to talk today about the Jews of Kaifeng, give some historical background first. Part 2 will be what there is there today and how we can understand something about the existence of Judaism there in China in the context of contemporary China, Reform-era China. A number of Jewish communities in China. We know from Marco Polo that there were communities in other places in China, in Hangzhou and other places, but surprisingly, the only community that survived was the community of Kaifeng. In 1163, the synagogue was established. We have here the steles where the arrival of the Jews is documented. There's kind of a history of Jewish history from Abraham through Ezra. These steles exist in the Kaifeng Museum. The steles express loyalty to the emperor, and like all religions in China, they try and show how Judaism is compatible with the Confucian tradition, and these are the prized artifacts of the community. As I will show later, there's actually almost nothing left in the Ming Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty gradually closed China for all kinds of reasons we won't go into today. And so basically the Kaifeng Jews were detached from the Jewish world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Nobody knew about them. We don't find any references to them in any Jewish texts. The person who discovered them in 1605, and I want to tell you the story because I think it says a lot about the community, is this guy, Matteo Ricci. He was a very famous Jesuit missionary, the first Jesuit missionary to China. In 1605, he was in Beijing, and he had a visitor, a guy by the name of Aitian, who was from the city of Kaifeng. Aitian had come to Beijing to participate in the official examination. This guy Aitian was coming to take the highest level examination, the Jianxi, and he had heard there's a man in town who claims he believes in one God, and that he claims that he's not a Muslim. When Aitian heard that this man who was a monotheist was sitting in Beijing, he of course assumed that he was Jewish. He went to see him, and he entered Ricci's room. Ricci and identified himself as a believer in one God. Ricci was very excited because he himself was on his quest to look for Nestorians. Both people, as they kind of stood in front of each other, were convinced that they had found long-lost brothers. Ricci took him into the prayer room. There was a picture of Mary and her child, and he kneeled. Aitian was convinced that the picture was of Rebecca and Jacob. And he kneeled as well, kind of as very typical Chinese courtesy. And he said to Ricci, apparently, we only have Ricci's account, unfortunately. We don't have, Aitian didn't write about it. Ricci wrote about it. He said that they usually do not worship images, but as far as he's concerned, respect to the ancestors is okay. We don't know how Aitian reacted, if he was disappointed or not, but he left, and he did inform Ricci about where exactly they were. Ricci sent a letter to the rabbi of the community of Kaifeng, telling them that he had not heard, but there was a new segment to the Bible, and that the Messiah had indeed come while they were in China. And the rabbi, in a very Jewish and a very Chinese way, wrote him back that according to their tradition, the Messiah will not come for another 10,000 years. 10,000 is a way in Chinese of saying a lot. He will not come for another 10,000 years, but since he was at that time quite old, he was willing to pass on the community to Ricci himself. If Ricci wanted to take on the rabbinate of Kaifeng Judaism after him, he was willing to give it to him, but he must stop with his abominable practice of eating pork. Ricci never answered the letter, but what we know is that after the rabbi died, the Jesuits were informed that the person who took over after him was his son, who was quite unlearned. And Ricci wrote a kind of a side note at the end of this whole description in his book. He said that he believed that the community was well on their way to become Mohammedan or heathen. The Jews were very well aware of Islam also because from a Chinese perspective, Islam and Judaism were very, very similar, and they had to, in fact, the Jews were called those who do not eat the sinews. That was one of their early name was a reference to the Gideon Elazar, because as kind of a way of differentiating that between them and the Muslims. You know, from a Chinese perspective, one God, no pork. Jews of Kaifeng were, by this point, very Chinese, and indeed did revere. They didn't have ancestor worship, but they had in their synagogue a hall in honor of their ancestors, big thing in China. This is 1605. In 1605, they were already quite on their way to disappearing. Yet, they survived for another 250 years. During the Ming era, one of the emperors gave the Kaifeng Jews 7 names, 7 family names. And those family names persist till this day. Not all of the clans are still, families are still found. Apparently one of them converted to Islam at a certain point. But of the 7, I believe that at least 5 or 6 are still around in one form or another. Christians were very interested in the Kaifeng Jews for, among other reasons, because they were convinced that the Kaifeng Jews had very old writings. It's a very common misconception to equate remote with ancient. The Christians were convinced that the Kaifeng Jews had arrived there before, because they were very far, they must be therefore very, very ancient, that they arrived there during the after the first temple's destruction, and that therefore they had the original text of the Torah, and in the original text of the Torah, Jesus would be mentioned, the prophecies would be there. In other words, that what we have today is a censored text of the Torah. They were very disappointed to discover that in fact their scroll was exactly identical to Jewish scrolls that they were acquainted with in Europe. They had this fantasy that they would find evidence, but they were very relentless at trying to get texts. They're trying to buy up texts from the Kaifeng Jews. In the early 20th century, there was an attempt by Jews from Hong Kong and Shanghai to contact the remnants of the community in Kaifeng, but nobody answered. There may have been nobody to answer. My father wrote an article in 1987 about the Jews of Kaifeng, in which he theorizes that it's possible that nobody answered because at that time it was already becoming not so popular to be in contact with foreigners. At this point already, or probably quite a long time before, there are no halachic Jews. The community intermarried pretty quickly. Lack of anti-Semitism is kind of helps with that. They intermarried, and apparently also in a Chinese way they went according to the father, patrilineal descent, so none of them were Jews at this point. They had this concept of themselves as Yisrael, which meant Israel, and later they had the concept Yotai, which meant Jewish. This is something that they didn't really know very much what it meant, but they had this concept that their fathers had come from somewhere else, and they held on to it. So there are 2 schools. When I mean schools, I mean that they're kind of their community centers where people come and learn. They learn Hebrew, they learn a little bit about the Chagim, they have their tefillah, some parts of the tefillah have been translated, they've learned some songs. It's all new. There's nothing that they have retained. The only thing that they've retained, from what I've heard from the guys here, is that they didn't eat pork, they didn't go and worship in temples, so in a sense they kind of converted to a non-religion. They didn't convert out, they just kind of dropped religion altogether, and they didn't marry Muslims, which is ironic in a sense, because it was necessary to differentiate between them and Islam because of the proximity. They didn't marry Muslims, but they did marry Han Chinese. That many of the people in the community are only married to descendants. And in fact, some of the most active members of the community and most identified members of the community have no relationship whatsoever to the Jewish past. This is a picture of a Chinese identity card taken out in 1987, quite late. And here it still says Yotai. They were able to write in their identity card that they were Jewish. Apparently the clerks there didn't care. They said Jewish, whatever. But that is no longer the case. Since the 90s, the Chinese government has made a decision. You have to make a choice. You're either Hui, which means the Muslim ethnicity, or you're Han, but you have to make a choice. There is no Jewish minority in China. As I said, there are 56 nationalities in China, and Judaism is not one of them. So you have to make a decision. Why? The reason has nothing to do with being anti-Jewish in any way. The Chinese government is not anti-Jewish. The story is that the list of ethnic minorities in China is a closed list. When it was compiled in the 1950s, there were over 400 groups that wanted to be recognized as a minzu, as a nationality. The Chinese government does not want to reopen that box. Once they reopen that box, everybody, there are hundreds of groups who would want status. So there is talk of rebuilding the synagogue. There is this woman who's trying to promote it. If that does happen, it will only be within the state auspices, and it will probably be a museum, definitely not a house of worship. My father wrote in the article in 1987 that his guess was that the Jews of Kaifeng would become Jews, even though there were no Jews there at the time. His assessment was that the Jews of the West will make them Jews. That's what he writes there. And I think that in many ways that is happening. There is no Jewish activity in any other city in China. The Kaifeng Jews are the only ancient community in China. It's a unique phenomenon. None of the Jews, after the Silk Road was closed in the late 14th century, we don't know what happened to those communities. There were other communities all over China, apparently Hangzhou and other places. They disappeared. They left. The only Jews in China, except for the Kaifeng Jews, are recent businessmen who are, in Beijing and Shanghai. There are Jews, but they're Western Jews. It's a different story. They're not Chinese citizens. Shanghai has non-Chinese citizens, but they're foreign Jews who are there doing business. It has a sizable community, but it's a different story. It's a story of the relationship between foreign nationals who are doing their religious thing, but these people are Chinese. It's as far as the government is concerned, it's a different story. Chabad houses, there are Chabad houses in China, and they function more or less openly. They're not supposed to allow Chinese in, theoretically. It's understood that it's only for Jews, but they function in the East, mostly in the east of China. The popular level of feeling towards Jews, the man in the streets just knows that Jews are very smart. He doesn't know anything more about Jews. It's interesting, the Chinese, what they like about Jews is what they like about their own tradition, that much of it has been lost. In other words, their emphasis is on education, family. These are all Confucian ideals, which the Chinese have lost, and they recognize in the Jews. It's basically their longing for their own tradition in many ways.